Chiakuin. In the early morning light, long before the politicians arrive and the cameras begin to flash, you can hear the quiet hum of ordinary people gathering in a vast hall in Johannesburg. Women in bright shawls, young students clutching notebooks, elderly men leaning gently on walking sticks. They are not here to protest, and they are not here to watch from a distance. They are here because for the first time in the history of the G20, the world has come to African soil to listen to them. 2. And then as the hall settles, the president of South Africa steps forward and begins with a word that carries the weight of centuries: Sanbonani. 3. A Zulu greeting, meaning, we see you. 4. Not hello, not welcome. 5. But we see your dignity, your humanity, your worth. 6. For many watching, especially those of us old enough to remember Cold War tensions, civil rights marches, Vietnam-era protests, the long fight against apartheid, those words feel like a gentle shock. A reminder that global leadership was never meant to be the privilege of the powerful. It was meant to be a shared responsibility. 7. This G20 Social Summit is unlike any gathering before it. Not just because it's happening in South Africa, but because the voices filling the room are not presidents or prime ministers. They are teachers, mothers, farmers, activists, disabled community leaders, youth delegates, church elders, union workers, and storytellers. A G20 of the people shaped not by elite boardrooms, but by lived experiences. 8. And it raises a question that many in the United States, especially those who have watched decades of global conflict, inequality, and broken promises, might quietly ask themselves. 9. If the world's powerful nations truly listened to ordinary people, would the global order look the same? 10. Would inequality still rise? 11. Would developing nations still be expected to stay silent? 12. Would decisions about the future still be made behind closed doors? 13. Stay with us as we walk through this historic moment, one that could redefine cooperation, leadership, and dignity for a new generation. 14. And if you believe that the truth matters more than the headlines, please subscribe and share this video with someone who still believes in a fairer world. 15. If you stood outside the convention hall that morning, you would notice something striking. Not the flags, not the security details, but the faces. A mother holding her toddler while waiting in line. A group of young women adjusting the straps of their traditional dresses. A wheelchair user carefully navigating the pavement as volunteers rushed to help. This was the first sign that the G20 Social Summit in South Africa would not be a summit of elites. It would be a summit of people, real ordinary people, whose lives are shaped by the decisions of the powerful, yet whose voices rarely reach the table. 16. When the South African president stepped onto the stage, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. He didn't begin with statistics or diplomatic phrases. Instead, he anchored the entire event with one word: Ubuntu. 19. I am because we are. 22. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was the framework of the entire summit, an insistence that global cooperation cannot be meaningful unless it recognizes the humanity of all participants, not just those with political titles. 23. To explain the gravity of this moment, the president turned back 70 years to two events in 1955 that shaped not just South African consciousness, but the entire global South. First was the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, held during a time when Africa and Asia were still struggling under the last shadows of colonial rule. Leaders from newly independent nations gathered not to ask permission from the West, not to beg for recognition, but to articulate their own identity. It was the first time the developing world spoke with its own voice, unfiltered. 24. The second event, perhaps even more emotional for South Africans, was the Congress of the People in Kliptown, where citizens of all races, black, Indian, colored, and white, risked harassment and arrest to draft the Freedom Charter. This document boldly proclaimed that the people shall govern, even while apartheid was tightening its grip. Many in the audience at the summit would have had grandparents or great-grandparents who lived through that era, who felt the sting of exclusion and the triumph of eventual liberation. 25. By invoking these two events, the president wasn't merely giving a history lesson. He was drawing a direct line from 1955 to today. Just as the people of Bandung and Kliptown demanded dignity, the people gathered at this G20 Social Summit were reclaiming their right to shape global policy. And there was something quietly revolutionary about that. 26. As he continued, the president reminded attendees that this summit was more than symbolic. It was the first G20 meeting of its kind to take place on African soil. Not just the first time African leaders hosted, but the first time the social summit, the heart, the voice, the conscience of the G20 came to a continent that had long been spoken about rather than spoken with. There was applause, but also a kind of heavy silence, as if the weight of the moment pressed on every chest in the room. 27. Then the president acknowledged what many were feeling. The world right now is unstable. 28 wars burning across continents, 29 economies shaken by inflation and debt, 30 climate disasters tearing through the homes of the poor, 31 political polarization widening the fractures within nations, 32. Against that chaotic backdrop, he argued the G20 cannot continue as an exclusive club. The decisions made in those rooms ripple outward into the lives of billions farmers choosing between seeds and school fees, children going to bed hungry, women surviving cycles of violence, elders watching their communities lose hope. If the G20 is to have legitimacy, he insisted it must listen to the people who live with the consequences of its policies. 33. That is why over the past year more than 100 dialogues had taken place between youth, women, business leaders, workers, disabled communities, academics, journalists, and grassroots activists. These weren't side events. They were the core of the summit. The president emphasized that the recommendations emerging from these conversations would shape the agenda for the leaders' meeting in the following days. 34. For the first time in G20 history, civil society was not outside the gates. It was at the center of the process. 35. And as the president looked across the hall filled not with suits, but with citizens, he said clearly, 36, you are making history. 38. If you walked through the hallway during the break sessions, you would see small groups forming everywhere, women comparing notes, youth delegates debating climate policy, union representatives speaking with disability advocates, and elders quietly observing the energy around them. These weren't random conversations. They were the threads that would soon tighten into a single moment of intensity the moment the summit reached its emotional and political peak. 39. That moment came when the president shifted from recalling history to confronting the present. His voice sharpened, his posture stiffened. The crowd sensed it before the words left his mouth. He declared that the international financial system built decades ago by a handful of powerful nations was no longer fit for purpose. It was trapping countries in cycles of debt, widening inequality, and denying billions of people the chance to live with dignity. 40. For a hall filled with ordinary people whose lives are shaped by inflation, unemployment, food insecurity, and climate shocks, these were not abstract criticisms. They were lived realities. A woman in the front row, a community organizer from rural Limpopo, nodded with tears in her eyes. A young farmer from Kenya leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. He had lost his harvest last year because global lenders raised interest rates and his government cut agricultural subsidies. The president's words were not academic. They were personal. 41. Then came the sentence that ignited the room, 42. There should be no bullying of one nation by another. 43. The hall erupted in applause, long, loud, emotional. Some people stood without realizing they had risen. Others clapped with the intensity of someone releasing years of frustration. The message was unmistakable. The era where a nation's GDP, military might, or political alliances determined its right to be heard must come to an end. 44. And yet this wasn't a speech of anger. It was a speech of accountability and dignity. The president wasn't calling for confrontation. He was calling for honesty. He insisted that the world's wealthiest nations, whether in Europe, North America, or Asia, must recognize that true cooperation cannot happen when some voices are amplified and others are silenced. 45. This was where the emotional and political climax blended. The president began listing the broad coalition of 20s that had contributed to the summit's recommendations: 46 women, 20, 47 youth, 20, 48 business, 20, 49 civil, 20, 51 labor, 20, 52 parliament, 20, 53 media, 20, 56 disability, 20, 59 urban, 20, 62. Each mention was met with applause not because the audience wanted praise, but because they felt seen. For once, global governance wasn't happening behind closed doors. It was happening in a room filled with the people whose lives would be directly shaped by it. 65. But the climax didn't stop there. The president then introduced a groundbreaking development, the creation of a global inequality report written with the involvement of Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz and other leading experts. This wasn't a polite suggestion. It was a demand for the world to measure inequality with the same seriousness and urgency it measures climate change. Shaka 68. He proposed something bold. 71. A global inequality panel operating with the same authority, global recognition, and institutional weight as the COP conferences. 74. A yearly reckoning. 77. A permanent mirror held up to the world's richest nations. 80. The reaction was powerful. You could feel a current move across the hall, something between relief and determination. A young woman from Brazil whispered to the person next to her, "Finally, they will have to look at us." A trade union leader from India let out a deep sigh, one that spoke of decades spent fighting for recognition. A South African grandmother reached for the hand of her granddaughter as if to say, "This is the world I want you to grow up in." 83. The intensity of the moment was not just in the president's words, but in the collective realization that change was no longer a dream, it was becoming policy. 86. By the time the applause faded, something had shifted. Delegates looked at each other differently with a kind of shared responsibility. The reactions were not just emotional, they were transformative. Many had come to the summit expecting another symbolic gathering. Few expected a direct challenge to the global power structure. 89. And yet, here it was, 92. A call echoed by hundreds of ordinary people, amplified by history, charged with emotion, and directed at the highest tables of global leadership. 95. This was the summit's turning point, the instant when the people ceased being spectators and became the authors of the next chapter. 98. When the president's words settled into the room, the impact wasn't merely emotional. It began unfolding immediately in the minds of the people sitting there. You could almost see it on their faces, teachers imagining their classrooms, mothers thinking about their children's future, health workers recalling the shortages they deal with every day. This summit was not about abstract diplomacy. It was about the daily struggles that define the lives of millions. 101. The civil consequences emerged most strongly when the president shifted the conversation to children. It was World Children's Day, a detail that many in the audience already knew, but few expected to play such a central role. He spoke about hunger, child poverty, and the silent suffering that often goes unnoticed in policy debates. A woman in the back row, a caregiver from Eastern Cape, covered her mouth as he described families who skip meals so their children can eat. She had seen this with her own eyes. Many in the hall had. 104. The president explained that South Africa itself would be launching significant interventions to fight child hunger. His tone made it clear this was not charity, this was justice. The room responded with warm, thoughtful applause, not the fiery reaction of earlier, but something deeper, something that sounded like relief. 113. Then he turned to the issue that weighed heavily on many, gender-based violence. You could feel the tension immediately. Several women straightened their backs. Others folded their arms, bracing themselves. The president did not soften his message. He declared that gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa would officially be treated as a national crisis, a word leaders rarely use unless something has reached a breaking point. 122. He quoted Thomas Sankara 131. There is no true social revolution without the liberation of women. 140. And then he added Sankara's haunting line, 143. May my eyes never see a society where half the people are held in silence. 146. The emotional weight of those words rippled across the hall. A young woman from Mozambique bowed her head. A grandmother wiped her eyes. Men in the audience looked down at their hands, grappling with the truth of the moment. The president wasn't just condemning violence, he was demanding a national transformation, calling on men and boys to challenge harmful norms, power imbalances, and cultures of silence. 149. This had enormous civil consequences. It meant funding changes, educational changes, legal changes, social changes. It meant the G20 could no longer discuss development without addressing the violence inflicted on women and girls, violence that undermines every measure of progress. 152. Politically, the message was just as powerful. By naming gender-based violence a crisis, the president was forcing the G20 to confront something governments often avoid. It wasn't just about South Africa. It was a mirror for the entire world: Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, even the United States. Any nation claiming leadership now had to confront its own failures. 155. He then connected this crisis to broader political structures. If violence erodes the social fabric, he explained, then gender justice strengthens democracies, economies, and communities. It creates societies that can withstand shocks, economic, environmental, and political. 158. The president also reminded the audience that the real roots of these problems and their solutions lie in civil society. Women's groups, disability networks, youth formations, media organizations, academia, faith leaders, labor unions. These were the roots that nourish every global decision. Without them, he warned, no summit declaration would endure. 161. You could sense a civil awakening taking shape in the hall. Delegates leaned closer to each other, some whispering urgently, others taking notes, as if preparing to bring these ideas home. The political message had become personal, and the personal had become political. 164. By the time the president paused, the consequences were clear. 167. This summit was not only redefining the G20. 170. It was redefining what it means to protect people. 173. And what it means to govern with dignity. 176. If someone from the United States, perhaps a retired school teacher in Ohio, a factory worker in Michigan, or a Vietnam veteran in Florida, had been sitting in the hall that day, they would have quickly realized something profound. This summit was not only about Africa speaking to itself, it was Africa speaking to the world. And more importantly, the world was finally listening. 179. As the president continued, he addressed a truth that many Americans over 60 understand all too well. Global power has never been evenly distributed. Throughout their lifetimes, they have watched wars justified by stability, trade deals shaped by the wealthy, and institutions built in an era when most developing nations had no seat at the table. The president's message was clear: that world is fading. The global South, once dismissed as peripheral, is now demanding equal voice. 182. But he wasn't attacking the United States. He was challenging the logic that has guided global leadership for decades. He emphasized that no country, no matter its GDP, military strength, or political alliances, should assume the right to speak over another. For older Americans who lived through the civil rights era or protested the Vietnam War, this sentiment carried a familiar echo: justice has no meaning unless it belongs to everyone. 185. The president framed it simply: 188. A nation's value should not be determined by wealth or weapons, but by the dignity of its people. 191. This resonated beyond Africa. Delegates from Europe nodded, recognizing the fractures appearing in the global system. Representatives from Latin America exchanged glances, hearing their own struggles reflected in the president's words. Asian youth delegates whispered to each other, energized by the idea that their generation might inherit a fairer world. 194. But it was toward the United States, directly or indirectly, that the underlying message landed most sharply. For decades, America has been both a leader and a gatekeeper in global affairs. Many in the hall admired the United States for its innovation, its democracy, its spirit of reinvention. But they also recognized a contradiction. The U.S. often champions equality at home while supporting inequality abroad through financial rules, trade barriers, and geopolitical pressure. 197. The president's declaration "there should be no bullying of one nation by another" was not a finger pointed at America, but a mirror held up to all powerful nations, inviting them to choose whether they would lead by example or by domination. 200. He connected this shift to the broader global awakening. 203. Latin America demanding fairer trade. 212. Southeast Asia asserting its strategic independence. 221. The Middle East developing its own regional economic blocs. 230. Africa, rising through regional alliances and new industrial strategies. In this context, he suggested the United States has a choice: either acknowledge the new multipolar world or risk becoming isolated from it. What struck many listeners, especially Western delegates, was his insistence that this transformation was not anti-American. In fact, it echoed America's own founding ideals: liberty, equality, self-determination. The president argued that these values must apply globally, not selectively, and then at the edge of his message was a quiet truth: leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso and reformers across Africa are reshaping the global expectation of leadership. They are asking questions that the world's powerful nations can no longer avoid. By the time he concluded this section, it was clear that the summit was not merely critiquing the old world order. It was inviting the United States and every global power to participate in building a new one. A world where respect is not requested but required, where dignity is not granted but recognized, and where the future no longer belongs to a few but to all. As the summit drew to a close, the hall quieted in a way that only happens when people sense they are witnessing something greater than themselves. The president's final words were not spoken to governments or diplomats, they were spoken to humanity. And he delivered them with an image so simple, so ancient, that even those watching from afar could feel its weight. He reminded the audience that long before the modern world drew borders and erected institutions, Africa's ancestors navigated vast deserts and mighty rivers, using nothing more than the sun, the stars, and the moon. There were no satellites, no treaties, no global indices. Nature was their compass, and dignity was their guide. Today, he said, the world needs a new compass, a compass rooted not in power, but in solidarity, not in control, but in cooperation, not in dominance, but in dignity. This G20 Social Summit, held for the first time on African soil, was in his view that compass, the blueprint, the beginning of a new direction for the world. And as he lifted the declaration prepared by civil society delegates, he told them that their voices would not sit on a shelf. They would guide the leaders' summit, shape future policies, and influence decisions that determine the fate of billions. But with that hope came a warning, one that many older Americans will recognize from their own lifetime of historical lessons: progress is never guaranteed. Every generation must defend its place in the world it hopes to build. The president cautioned that the headwinds are real: geopolitical tensions, economic rivalries, climate disasters that strike hardest at the poor, financial structures still tilted toward the powerful, and political divisions that make cooperation fragile. Yet he insisted that none of these obstacles are stronger than ordinary people if their voices are heard and their dignity upheld. For viewers in the United States, the message is deeply personal. Many of you have lived through eras of protest reform, civil rights war, and reinvention. You know better than anyone that global change rarely begins in palaces. It begins in communities, churches, union halls, classrooms, and small gatherings where people dare to imagine something better. That same spirit is rising across Africa today, from South Africa's social movements to Burkina Faso's push for sovereignty under leaders like Ibrahim Traoré. The continent is demanding a voice equal to its worth, and Africa News is increasingly showing the world that these calls can no longer be ignored. So here is the question the president left unspoken, but one we must ask ourselves. Are we ready for a world where the people, not the powerful, set the direction? And what would it mean if we refuse to accept the old order any longer? If you believe these questions matter, if you believe that dignity belongs to every person, no matter where they live, then this is your moment to stay informed, stay engaged, and help carry this conversation forward. Please share this video if you believe the world deserves a new compass, and subscribe if you believe that truth and justice should guide global leadership, not fear or force.